Howdy Year 10 historians, and welcome to our second lesson on being counted, which is about the 1967 referendum. Okay, our learning goals for today are: you're going to know about the different policies that have applied to Indigenous people, and you're going to be able to use chronology to place events on a timeline. You're going to do a little timeline activity. Fun. So before we get stuck into some notes, I just wanted to briefly show you this. This is the tally, the vote tally from the 1967 referendum. Yep. So there were 6 million, just over 6 million people enrolled in total. And you can see there that the percentage of people who voted for it was 90.77%. So about 500,000 people voted against the referendum, but that's a fairly strong level of support. All up, I think we can safely say. The lowest level of support was in Western Australia, and the highest levels were in Victoria and New South Wales. Victoria and New South Wales are states that have large capital cities with cosmopolitan people living there, and so are more likely to be socially progressive. That possibly explains the higher level of people voting yes in favour of the referendum. Okay, so the 1967 referendum, one would say, represents a change, a shift from a policy of assimilation, trying to make Indigenous people like white British people. The obvious example there being the stolen generation and removing mixed race Indigenous people and making them not live with their birth families. A very depressing call. Anyway, a shift from assimilation policy to integration. So, assimilation means a minority group or culture comes to represent a dominant group, and obviously in Australia that was the Indigenous people trying to be assimilated into the dominant group, which was white European or white British culture. Integration means removing segregation. So removing any, there's lots of examples of segregation from the US and from South Africa. Some good examples there where people of different races went to different schools, stuff like that. Anyway, integration is removing all of that, removing barriers and creating equal opportunity between people of different races. So the policy changed because there was an international movement to end racial discrimination. In the 1960s, there was a huge move to have racial equality in the US, and we see similar. We see a lot of pressure on Australia to do the same. And there were a large number of migrants to Australia after World War II, so we couldn't really assimilate all of these different migrant groups that came into Australia after World War II. And so slowly the country decided that the assimilation policy wasn't going to work with the vastly increasing amount of diversity within Australia. Now, integration is not full multiculturalism. We need to remember that. It still expects citizens to adapt to the new country, not the other way around. Yeah. So in Australia, we would say that we do have a multicultural policy now, although it kind of is assumed that new migrants will eventually adopt Australian culture. So here's a slide that kind of shows you what the different policies were in terms of cultural diversity, or whatever. Yeah. So the White Australia policy, which was the policies that started in 1901 when Australia first became a country, the idea that they essentially wanted to have mostly white migrants and have a white country. Obviously a fairly racist policy. Then we had assimilation through the 50s and into the 60s, and then integration from the 60s into the 70s, and then after that multiculturalism and reactions to multiculturalism. So the bit that we're focusing on in terms of the 1967 referendum is this bit here where it went from assimilation to integration. Yeah, round about here is the 1967 referendum. Great lettering. Okay, your activity today is chronology. I want you to put these events in the correct order on a timeline. So draw a line in your book with an arrow at each end. Now you might have to do a bit of research here, or you might know some of it off by heart already. That's cool. I want you to put these in a timeline and include the years. the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Wave Hill Walk-Off. Hint, there's going to be a cartoon about that in our upcoming source analysis assignment. The Mabo case, so this is when Eddie Mabo, a man from Torres Strait, took the government to court and won, and it was the start of native title land rights for Indigenous people in Australia. The referendum to include Indigenous in the census, we've just been talking about that. I really hope you know the date of that already. The Bringing Them Home report, this was the report that shone a light on the stolen generations. Kevin Rudd's apology. The Northern Territory emergency response, that was when the government identified that there was high levels of substance abuse and child abuse in certain Indigenous communities, and they sent the army in. It's a fairly controversial policy. So I want you to put them in the correct order from earliest to latest on a timeline. Okay, today's video is from the National Library of Australia. It's about the 1967 referendum. Take it away.
Hi, my name is Yanti, and I'm an educator at the National Library of Australia. Today, I want to talk to you about a very important event to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the 1967 referendum. Why is this important, you might ask? It's a very good question. To answer this, we will take a step back in time to the pivotal events leading up to that life-changing event. Over 50 years ago, around 90% of electors voted yes in a federal referendum to alter two clauses in the Australian Constitution in reference to Aboriginal peoples. So what makes this event so significant to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? Firstly, it gave Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders reassurance that they were included and counted in the overall Australian census. They were now Australian citizens. Secondly, of the 44 attempts to amend the Constitution, only 8 have succeeded, and the vote on the 27th of May 1967 was, and still is, the highest ever achieved. The year is 1956. Concerned with the current plight of Australia's Indigenous peoples, Jessie Street, a renowned activist, urges Aboriginal leader Pearl Gibbs and South Sea Islander activist Faith Bandler to form the Aboriginal Australian Fellowship and start petitioning for a referendum to change the Constitution. So what did the Constitution say about Australia's first peoples? In 1901, the Australian Constitution included 2 references to Aboriginal peoples. Section 51, which states, "The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of the Commonwealth, respect to," Clause 26, "the people of any race other than Aboriginal race in any state for whom it is deemed necessary to make special law." This meant that the Commonwealth government didn't want to take responsibility for Aboriginal people. They felt it was in the states and territories' interests to look after them. Section 127. In reckoning the numbers of the people of the Commonwealth or of a state or other part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. This meant that Aboriginal people could not be counted as an Australian or be called an Australian. So what needed to be done to bring about these changes? I'll tell you in more detail. Firstly, a signed petition calling for the immediate changes to the Constitution, particularly to Sections 51, Clause 26, and Section 127. Secondly, a national campaign to highlight the appalling conditions faced by many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders living throughout Australia, and to involve the whole of the country. To alter the 2 clauses in the Australian Constitution, Jessie Street, Brian Fitzpatrick, and Christian Jolie Smith would compose a draft petitioning outlining what needed to be changed immediately. The petition, which was launched on the 29th of April 1957 and led by the Aboriginal Australian Fellowship leaders Pearl Gibbs and Faith Bandler, with the help of prominent activist Jessie Street, would end up collecting just over 100,000 signatures, a huge success. Therefore, to keep this movement going, a national organisation was needed so that a joint national campaign for Aboriginal rights would start to bring the message to the Australian people. The Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders was established, in which Joe McGuinness became the first Aboriginal president after Gordon Bryant of FACSI. The council took responsibility for the national campaign for constitutional change, which would be a driving force for the 1967 referendum. After 10 hard years of campaigning and significant protests around the country, on the 27th of May 1967, a referendum was held to change the Australian Constitution.
Okay, it's time for a pop quiz. 10 questions, just write the answers down. I'll try and leave you enough time so you don't have to pause this as we go. Question 1. What year? Now, there's no point cheating, okay? If you get it wrong, who cares? Test your memory. What year was the Australian Freedom Ride? Question 2. What other country also had freedom rides? Question 3. In what year did Indigenous people get the vote? Not counting Queensland. Question 4. In what year did Indigenous people get the vote in Queensland? It was a few years later. Question 5. What is a census? Question 6. What policy existed before and after the 1967 referendum? We just spoke about that. Question 7. What percentage, to the nearest whole number, voted yes to the 1967 referendum? Question 8. What diversity policy exists in Australia now? Question 9. What two pressures were on Australia to change its policy in the 1960s? So why did Australia change its policy? A couple of things that we've spoken about in this and the last lesson. In question 10. What is one drawback to the policy of integration? Right. Time for the answers. Freedom Ride in Australia was 1965. Another country that had freedom rides, of course, was the United States of America. Indigenous people got the vote in 1962. Except in Queensland, where they got the vote in 1965. A census is a regular count of the population. Assimilation was the policy before 1967, and then it became integration after the 1967 referendum. How many people voted yes to the 1967 referendum? 90.2%. Although that table I showed you earlier on this lesson said 90.77%. So whatever. If you had 90 or 91%, you can have that one. What diversity policy exists in Australia now? It is, of course, multiculturalism. What two pressures were on Australia to change its policy in the 60s? International government pressure and other Indigenous people were getting rights overseas. For example, the US. And finally, one drawback of the policy of integration, it still expects migrants to take on the culture of the new country. Okay. The 1967 referendum was a change to the Australian Constitution, so we're going to do a little homework task about constitutions. A constitution is a list of principles that help run something. So countries have constitutions, so do clubs, organisations, stuff like that. What I want you to do is I want you to write a constitution for your family. You've probably been spending quite a lot of time with them. at the moment. So I want you to write at least 5 articles or 5 rules or governing principles for how your family should run. Have fun with that. For those of you who are keen as beans, here's some bonus homework. I want you to read chapter 4.8, Being Counted, or maybe you read it from last time, and check out this video. This is a little short doco called Counted, the 1967 referendum. It's by Stan Grant. It's pretty awesome. Again, this is the same bonus homework as last time, I believe, and the URL is bit.ly/counted1967. Thank you so much for getting stuck into this lesson, and as always, keep it real.